Don't let me catch you talking about werewolves. Granddad sat down on the edge of my bed. The mattress sagged beneath his weight. This isn't a bloody storybook. It had been several hours since Dad left with Mom. I had been sat up in my bed, watching the sky outside my window fade to black, watching as the glow from the moon grew brighter. When Granddad finally arrived half an hour ago, the headlights from his Land Rover spilling into our driveway, I felt a mixture of excitement and fear, the same way I'd felt when I was speaking to Dad earlier. In the time Granddad had been in my room, I'd already asked him what felt like 100 different questions, and we'd barely even scratched the surface. So, you're not a werewolf then? I forced myself to meet Granddad's gaze. His blue eyes stared back at me, bright and unblinking. After a moment, he looked away and sighed. It's not a word anyone uses, he muttered. I suppose there are similarities to what you're thinking of, but it's different, not like in the films. But whatever happens to us, it happens when the moon's full, right? Well, yes, and no, not exactly. Granddad frowned and paused for a moment. He stared down at my duvet, as if he could find an answer in it. Then he let out a sudden, throaty chuckle, grinned and shook his head. I went through all of this with your mother, but I'm still no good at explaining it. It's like falling asleep in a way, moving between awake and sleeping, between different states. You can do it anytime you want, but it'll happen quicker if you're already tired. And if you're really tired, it's hard to avoid. I stared at Granddad, trying to understand what he meant. He must have seen the confusion on my face. Sorry, lad, I'm not explaining myself well at all. What I mean is, we can change anytime we want. Older ones who've lived with it for years can change in a matter of minutes, but there are times of the month when the moon is at its fullest. I mean, when changing is a lot easier. Like how sleep comes easier when you're tired, and on the night it's completely full. The change can be, well, it can be almost impossible to control, even when you're as old as I am. He smiled at me, but I didn't smile back. I was trying to concentrate on everything he'd been saying, trying to take it all in. Questions were building in my head, and I didn't know which to ask first. So, when you do change, I said after a moment, when we change, what do we change into? What does it look like? Granddad stared back at me. He was silent for a few moments before he opened his mouth to speak. Well, His sentence was cut off by the sound of a car passing on the road outside. Headlights flared in the darkness outside my window, then faded again. The noise of an engine briefly filled the room, dwindling as the car drove off into the distance. When I looked back at Granddad, I saw he was on his feet. He marched over to the window and frowned out into the darkness. I knew he should have done this at the cottage. He muttered the words under his breath, but they were just loud enough for me to hear. Stupid of me coming here. Granddad? Hey. What do you mean, stupid? Why is it stupid? Granddad glanced back at me. Thick frown lines traced his forehead. It's nothing you need to worry about. I wanted your dad to bring you to my cottage, that's all, but the stubborn bastard wouldn't do it. Said you were too ill. What's wrong with you coming here? It's risky, that's what. Any trace of a smile had gone from Granddad's face. If you're going to learn about all this, you might as well learn that first. It's a risk, all of it. A constant struggle to stay hidden. And you don't get to be my age without making a few enemies, I'll tell you that. I stared past Granddad at the darkness beyond my bedroom window, stared at the light of the moon. My body still ached, but for now a spike of adrenaline had made me forget the worst of it. I suddenly realized I'd never seen Granddad outside his cottage before. What enemies? I said after a moment. Are there people after you? Granddad let out another low chuckle. This time there was no humor in it. Not just me, he said. The whole clan. There's always someone. Hunters out for a trophy, big companies, people wanting your skin, the government. We try our best to keep everything secret, but it's no good. People see things and people talk. It always gets out. Granddad reached out suddenly and tugged the curtains across my window shut, blocked out the moonlight. He stood at the end of my bed, staring down at me. If we're going to talk, we'll do it downstairs, he growled. I'm not standing here like your bloody nursemaid. He turned and left the room before I had a chance to respond. We sat in the lounge opposite one another. Granddad in an armchair near the front door, me on the sofa, curtains drawn. Yellow light spilled down from the bulb overhead. A light rain had started outside, and it drummed against the window like 1,000 soft fingers. Every now and then a car would pass by on the road, and each time Granddad's body would tense, just a little. He'd try to hide it, but I saw. I still felt ill. My body ached and my skin itched. I felt weak and tired. But for now, at least, I could almost forget about those things. Adrenaline, fear, and excitement swirled in my stomach. I wanted to ask Granddad about his mask and why he wasn't wearing it, but I was worried he'd get angry again, like he had in my room. I'd heard the temper in his voice then, and I didn't want to be on the receiving end of it. So instead I asked a different question. Where does Mum go? I asked. When she's away each month, I mean. Where is she? She stays with a couple of friends of mine, said Granddad. Old friends, part of the clan. They live in the New Forest too, about 5 miles from me. They've helped me with her, helped me show her the ropes. But why does she have to stay away? Why can't she do what you do? Granddad fixed his blue eyes on mine, ran a hand through his thick white beard, scratching the skin underneath. It takes a long, long time to get used to the change, he said after a moment. I've lived with it for years, and even then your dad still wanted me to put that chuffing thing on my face when I was around you. Block out the smell on the worst nights. Granddad shook his head. I didn't need it, and it pissed me off that he thought I might. But I let it go. I let it go because he sees your mother when she's in her other state, and he knows how bad it can get. How bad it can get? Granddad opened his mouth to reply, but at that moment another car engine sounded in the distance. He paused listening. The engine grew louder. After a few moments, I saw headlights illuminate the drawn curtains of the lounge window. The engine swelled as the car drove past the house. I heard the splash of wheels on wet tarmac. The engine faded as the car continued down the road. And then it suddenly cut off. Granddad froze. His face was set in a mask of concentration. After a moment, he cocked his head slightly to one side, presumably listening for the sound of the engine starting back up again. It didn't come. I listened too, and I couldn't hear a thing. Only the rain growing steadily heavier outside, pattering against the glass. Wind gusted around the house, causing the trees in our garden to rustle. It's probably just one of our neighbors, Granddad, I said. I think the car... I stopped talking when Granddad held up a hand. He shook his head. The frown lines on his forehead were so deep now they looked like cuts. No, he muttered after a moment. Someone's coming. My skin suddenly felt cold. I had no reason to be afraid, but the tension on Granddad's face was rubbing off on me. I strained my ears for a sound, but I still couldn't hear anything. Only the rain. Granddad, it's nothing, I whispered. There's nobody out. Our garden gate creaked open. The sound was soft but clear. The familiar squeal of old hinges. It cut through the wind and rain. My skin prickled with an unpleasant heat, and my heartbeat picked up in my chest. Granddad was on his feet. He crept over to the little front door in the corner of our lounge, moving without making a sound. Our house is tidier than Granddad's cottage, but it's still almost as old. The ceilings are low. Standing just to the left of the front door in the shadowy entrance to our dining room, Granddad had to crouch. Stood up straight. The top of his head would have touched the ceiling. The front door was smaller than he was. His blue eyes were fixed on the little square of frosted glass set in its center. I started to get up from the sofa, but he held out his hand again, motioned for me to stay where I was. A second later, I heard footsteps crunching across our gravel drive. I held my breath. Every inch of my skin prickled and itched. I stared at the little window on our front door, waiting to see movement on the far side of it, trying to tell myself I had nothing to be afraid of. It was probably just Dad. That was all. Dad coming back to pick something up. Maybe something he'd forgotten. It was a little strange that he hadn't parked the car right outside our house, but there had to be an explanation for that, didn't there? Who else would it be? As these thoughts rushed through my head, a shadow appeared on the far side of the frosted glass, a shape in the darkness. I held my breath again, feeling my heart pound my ribcage like a fist. For a second, nothing happened. And then someone was rapping their fist against the front door, over and over again. "Hello? Is anyone home?" It was a man's voice, not someone I recognized. "Hello? Can anyone help me, please? I saw a light on." Granddad stayed completely still. He stared at the door, his face unchanging. The knocking continued. After a moment, the man spoke again. His voice sounded close to panic. "Please, if someone's there, can I use your phone? Our car's broken down and we don't have any signal. Please, my wife isn't very well." Granddad hesitated for another second. Then he reached out and tugged the door open. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see the man in the porch, but I could hear everything he was saying clearly enough. "Oh, thank you so much. I'm so sorry to trouble you. We've had an absolute nightmare. Our car's broken down just a little way along the road, and my wife is unwell. She's 8 months pregnant, you see, and we're on our way to Bournemouth to visit friends. But my phone lost signal, and I was taking what I thought was a shortcut. Stupid of me, I know. And then we got this warning light on the dashboard a little while back, and I watched Granddad's face as the man babbled on and on. His expression was fixed and hard to read, but I thought at least some of the tension had gone out of it. So if you have a mobile I could use or a landline," the man continued, "then I can make a very quick call to the AA, and I'll be out of your hair. I'm so sorry again for the intrusion. What's that in your hand?" Granddad's gruff voice cut through the man's rambling. I stared at his face, but his expression remained the same. "Oh, this is a walkie-talkie," said the man. "I may not be able to navigate to save my life, but I always worry about safety. Over-worry, actually. Paranoid, that's what my wife calls me. We ran out of petrol in the middle of nowhere once, and I've carried a pair of these in the car ever since, along with a first aid kit and some spare clothes, just in case, you know? You never know when these things might come in handy. In fact, that reminds me." He fell silent for a moment. A few seconds later, I heard a soft beeping sound. "Hi, sweetheart, it's me," he said. "A nice gentleman down the road has just opened the door, so I'll call the AA and be back as soon as possible, okay? Over." There was a faint crackling noise. After a moment, I heard the tiny sound of a woman's voice responding. "Okay, be as quick as you can," she said. "I'm really not feeling good, Tim." Over. "I will, sweetheart. I promise." Over. The crackling sound cut off. There was a moment of silence, and then Granddad sighed. He looked weary, but any sign of the previous tension in his face had gone. "Right then. Right. Come in then," he said. "You can use my phone, but you'd better make it quick. My grandson's not well either." He edged back away from the door. A moment later, the man stepped into the lounge. Any residual fear I may have felt vanished the minute I saw him. He was about half the size of Granddad. What was left of his thinning black hair was slicked down against his forehead from the rain. He wore glasses that were speckled with water drops. His raincoat dripped onto the carpet. As soon as he saw me, he raised a nervous hand in greeting and started babbling again. "Hi there. I'm Tim. Sorry to intrude. I just need to make a very quick call and I'll be out of your way again. My wife and I have had a nightmare this evening. Granddad shoved his mobile phone into the man's hand, cutting him off mid-flow. "There, you can use that." "Oh, perfect. Thank you so much." Tim looked up at my granddad with wide-eyed gratitude. "I'll be as quick as I can, I promise." He tapped at the screen of Granddad's phone, then raised it to his ear, smiled across at me, and I smiled back. Granddad hovered near him, watching. He didn't say anything else or look at me. After a few moments of waiting, Tim started babbling into the phone. Hi. Yes, I'm Tim Ferriss. Yes. I think we may need someone to come out and help us, I'm afraid. Yeah, we've had a bit of car trouble. We're out near... Tim's voice droned on and on. After a minute of talking, he got his AA card out of his wallet and began reciting numbers. I began to grow aware of just how much my body was aching again. The adrenaline I'd felt earlier was fading, and I now had a hollow feeling in my stomach too, like I needed to eat. My skin itched, and I had to resist the urge to scratch my arms. To distract myself, I watched Granddad. He looked suddenly uncomfortable. He was standing in the same spot as before, staring at Tim, but now he was shuffling back and forth, like he couldn't keep still. He kept running a hand through his beard, his eyes never leaving Tim's face. When Tim finally hung up the phone and handed it back to Granddad, I felt a hard-to-place sense of relief. Great, they're sending someone out now, Tim said. They're going to call back in 5 minutes with an ETA. So sorry again about all of this, and do you mind if I wait for their call? Granddad grunted in response. Tim turned to me and smiled. And what did you say your name was, matey? Your granddad told me you're feeling a little bit under the weather? I nodded. I'm James, I said. I've got the flu or something, I think. Tim frowned and nodded his head. Nasty stuff. Something's going around at the moment, so is it just the two of you here tonight then? Mom and Dad not about? I opened my mouth to reply, then paused. Tried to think what was best to say. I couldn't tell the man where Mom and Dad really were, but at the same time, I couldn't just ignore the question. I glanced over at Granddad, but he was frowning down at the phone in his hand, not listening. They're out tonight, I said after a moment. They've gone out for a meal in town. Ah, very, very nice, very nice. Well, hopefully their car's a bit more reliable than mine, eh? Out for the whole night, are they? Tim smiled across the room. Outside the house, the wind gusted harder than ever. Rain drummed against the window in heavy sheets. I opened my mouth, unsure how best to respond. But before I had a chance, Granddad spoke. Your call didn't go through. Tim turned away from me and looked at Granddad. The call you made just now, it didn't go through. Sorry, how do you mean? Granddad's blue eyes were fixed on Tim. He stared at him without blinking. What I mean is the call you just made only lasted 3 seconds. It's right here in my log. You dialed a number, then ended the call almost straight away. Why? Oh, sorry, I don't... Tim trailed off and looked at Granddad. His eyes flicked from Granddad's face to the mobile phone in his hand, then back again. That's bizarre, he said after a moment. There must be some kind of mistake. I definitely got through to someone. Maybe your phone didn't record it properly, or... Well, are you sure you're looking at the right... I know exactly what I'm looking at. The call didn't go through, which means you were only pretending to speak on the phone just now. And I want you to tell me why. Tim stared at my granddad. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Wind howled across the eaves of the house. Rain continued to drum down. There was a beat when everything inside was still, and the only noise I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then everything happened at once. Tim raised the walkie-talkie to his mouth and pushed the button. He backed away across the lounge towards the front door, bellowing into the mouthpiece as he moved. Now, go now, the kid's here too, and... It was as far as he got. Granddad's hand shot out and swiped the walkie-talkie from Tim's grip. It smashed against the wall of the lounge and fell to the carpet, where it cracked and fell silent. Granddad moved quicker than I thought was possible. He closed the distance between himself and Tim in one large step, gripping the man's head in 2 large hands. Tim's glasses went tumbling off his face. He screamed. The sound cut off as Granddad jerked his hand sharply to the right, snapping Tim's neck in one clean motion. He released his grip, and Tim crumpled to the floor. On the road outside, I heard the distant sound of a car engine starting. Granddad turned to stare at me, his blue eyes blazing. Get up, he said. We have to get out of here, right now. Thank you for making it this far. I hope you enjoyed the video. I just wanted to quickly let you know about a couple things I have going on. I have an Instagram where I post more personal things about who I am. It isn't just all creepy stuff. You can find me at Stories After Midnight. I also have a Twitter where I mainly retweet and like things I find interesting. The handle for that is in the description, but it is S_A_midnight. I should really find another one because that's hard to say. If you really like what I'm doing, consider joining the Midnighters. That's my growing community where we hang out and have fun and talk about cats. You can find a link to our Discord in the description below. We'd love to see you there. Other than that, it'd make me happier than a cat on a table full of antique glassware if you'd like the video and consider sticking around for more. We'll see you in the next one.